everybody. In Chapter 10, we are going to be taking a closer look at how psychology contributes to criminal investigations, as well as more specific types of violence with multiple murder, school, and workplace violence. So let's start with talking about investigative psychology. So this was a term that was coined by David Carter, who was the director for investigative psychology at the University of Liverpool. And it is taking the psychological principles and applying them to criminal investigation. And they seek to answer kind of three fundamental questions. Number one, what are the important behavioral features of the crime that can help us to identify and prosecute the perpetrator? Number two, what inferences can we make about the characteristics of the offender that may help us identify him or her? And these inferences are typically made either by the crime scene characteristics or from the victimology. And number three, are there any other crimes that are likely to have been committed by the same person? This is called case linkage. What can we, what information, what evidence, what MO, what signature can allow us to connect cases together? And that it would be for serial offenses. So here in the United States, we call investigative psychology criminal profiling. So there are different types of criminal profiling. So criminal profiling is a term that is widely used when we apply it to gathering various kinds of information about a person or persons. There are different types of criminal profiling. There is clinical criminal profiling. That is the clinical approach, which is case focused to infer trait characteristics of an offender from the analysis of evidence gathered. In criminal profiling, we call this idiographic profiling. Actuarial approach is we focus on database gathered from a group of offenders, basically statistics, who have committed similar crimes. In criminal profiling, this is called nomothetic profiling. So idiographic profiling is looking at the specific characteristics of a crime scene or an offender, and nomothetic is looking at statistics that psychologists and basically the FBI have gathered on offenders. By the way, the FBI really is kind of the leader of this here in the United States, and they created something called the FBI manual. And the FBI manual, FBI crime classification manual, does have those nomothetic statistics in it that they have gathered by interviewing convicted offenders or by looking at patterns or crime statistics. So, for example, if you say something like the average serial killer here in the United States is a white male in their mid to late 20s to mid to late 30s. That would be an example of nomothetic data. That is, statistically speaking, we know that from looking at serial killers and interviewing serial killers. So the five types of profiling that you might hear about are psychological profiling, suspect-based profiling, geographical profiling, and crime scene profiling. And equivocal death analysis would also be considered to be a type of profiling, but it's a little bit different. So I talked about the clinical approach, and again, that is looking at the evidence of a single offender or single case. And from an investigator's profile, that's really based on your experience and training, but you're looking at what kind of evidence can be gathered from the crime scene, from this particular case. And again, the actuarial approach is looking at statistics that have been gathered on groups of similar offenders or similar crimes, called nomothetic data. So psychological profiling is to identify and be able to predict the behavior of known individuals. So the goal is to identify and predict behavior. Psychological profiling of Negative characteristics associated with criminal behavior consist of two basic types of approaches. Threat assessment, determining the validity of threats against individuals or organizations, or risk assessment, determining if, and again, because we're talking about individuals we know here, and we are trying to determine if threats that they are making are credible, and that can be to themselves, to others, to organizations, or risk assessment. Is this individual a risk to themselves or to others? So this could be through the courts, through determining if somebody should get probation, should somebody be granted parole, things like that. Suspect-based profiling, also called prospective profiling, is identifying the psychological and behavioral characteristics typically associated with a particular crime. This is an example of both actuarial or nomothetic profiling that uses statistics. The TSA would be an example of this, border crossing racial profiling, which of course is illegal, but who are the offenders that are typically associated with a particular type of crime. Geographic profiling. This is an interesting one. It can help us to locate where several offenders live, or where they're, by mapping things out, we can determine if somebody lives and works in an area where they're offending. This is usually used for serial offenses, by the way, because you're kind of mapping out the crime locations. It uses computer software to map out crimes, neighborhoods, location. The current popular software for this is based on Kim Rossmo's work. He was the first PhD in criminology in Canada who created the software program for his PhD. Based on his research, by the way, he found 4 patterns that are used in geographical profiling. The first is the hunter. They set out from their home or in their neighborhood to find victims, and they tend to be geographically stable. The poacher is the second one. These are transient. They travel some distance from their home. Third is the troller. They rely on random encounters, so geographic profiling probably won't work for this. And then the trapper, they create situations to trap their victims, like the Craigslist killer that you might have heard about. It's interesting if you look up geographic profiling of the Jack the Ripper case, by the way, you can see where they have used this computer software and taken maps of old London and mapped out where each of the victims were found, and based on that, they've been able to kind of determine where they think the offender lived, or at least worked. And the same thing can be done with serial killers, with serial robbers, with serial home burglaries. Again, you map out all of the offenses, and once you have this visual image of where all of these cases are taking place, you can kind of determine where a person may work or live, which can help you in your investigation. Now, crime scene profiling is probably the most popular type of criminal profiling that we use here in the United States, and this is of unknown offenders, and it is looking at the specifics of the crime scene. So the process by identifying personality traits, behavioral patterns, could be geographical patterns, cognitive tendencies, and demographic features of an unknown offender based on the characteristics of the crime. So it's the process of identifying all of these things by looking at the evidence that you have at the crime scene. You can also look at victimology as well, looking at the history of the victim, the type of victim, the MO, the signature. Crime scene analysis was developed by the Behavioral Science Unit of the FBI in the 1970s, led by John Douglas. He and other leaders created the crime classification manual that I told you about earlier. And there's a PDF document in D2L that has a copy of that if you'd like to take a look. Douglas and Munn identified 3 important features that could be evident at the crime scene that we still use today. And by the way, There's a television show on Netflix called Mindhunter. You may or may not have heard of it. I think they have 2 seasons right now, but Mindhunter, although it is a show that was created for entertainment purposes, it's about how the FBI behavioral science unit started and how they started gathering all this nomothetic data and how they started coming up with things like MO and signature and staging and organized versus unorganized crime scene. So it is entertaining, but it's also a really interesting look at how they started by going out and interviewing known offenders and gathering all kinds of information so that they could come up with the nomothetic data. They also came up with some very important terms that are still used today. Modus operandi, you've probably heard of that as MO. These are the actions and procedures that an offender engages in when committing a crime. What's interesting about MO is it can change. So putting too much weight on MO can lead to errors, especially when you're trying to connect cases. So you might have, let's say, you have some home burglaries, and the MO, how they get in, is by slicing a screen on, the back part of a house. And you're able to link a couple of cases together because they have that similar MO. And then all of a sudden you have a case in the same neighborhood, but now a window is broken in the front of the house. What you might say, well, it's not the same MO, so we're looking at 2 different offenders here. But MO can change. Offenders learn and they change as they go along. So you have to be kind of mindful of that as an investigator. Jack the Ripper, a very famous serial case, the MO was attacking known prostitutes at night in alleys. So that's an example of MO. Now, signature is a little bit different. Signature is anything that goes beyond what is needed to commit the crime. Typically associated with serial offenders, they often have kind of repetitive or ritualistic signatures. The Boston Strangler, taking women's pantyhose and strangling them with them. Signature with Jack the Ripper was eviscerating and like taking organs from victims. You don't need those things to commit the crime, but it's something that kind of goes beyond what is needed to commit the crime. Signature does allow you to kind of connect things together, like with the Boston Strangler, like with Jack the Ripper. Not all crimes have a signature, so it's not something that you will see all of the time. But again, like with Jack the Ripper, slicing victims open, taking out the organs, the Boston Strangler. Staging is the intentional alteration of a crime scene, and it's usually done by pretty well-organized offenders who are trying to redirect the investigation or to protect victims, to protect their family, or because they get some kind of control or pleasure from it. You might have heard of, crime cases where the victims were staged in provocative poses. And again, that's kind of a power play. A way to humiliate the victim. The offender gets some kind of pleasure from that. There are staging where, it wasn't actually a burglary, it was a personal crime, but the person, ransacks the house to kind of throw investigators off to make it look like it was a burglary gone wrong. Covering up victims. We see this a lot of time when kids are victimized, or if somebody victimizes somebody they know, they cover up the body, or they pose the body in a way where it looks like they're trying to protect the victim. So you have to kind of be mindful and look for those things. Crime scenes are also classified as either organized or disorganized, and inferences can be made about the offender based on these features. Organized crime scenes imply that there's planning, or they imply that the offender is that this isn't their first crime. So you don't see a lot of disarray. There's not a lot of evidence left behind. There are no weapons left behind. With a disorganized crime scene, it implies that it may not have been a planned crime, that it's not a experienced offender. You see stuff all over the place. A lot of evidence is left behind. So that's another thing that the FBI came up with, this organized versus disorganized offenders. Profiling, this type of profiling is used by a lot of agencies. It's particularly helpful in looking at serial killings and serial offenses when you're trying to link cases together. Criminal profiling, by the way, we have a great course on criminal profiling here at the university. I teach it, and a lot of other people in the department teach it. It's a really interesting class. I highly recommend it for anybody who's thinking about going into any type of criminal investigation. Now, criminal profiling itself is not really a targeted or realistic career path. The FBI does have a unit that engages in this, but they're usually called out to consult with state agencies, and state agencies send their investigators to the FBI to be trained. But you can't really become a profiler to have, there are very few people that are actually profilers with the FBI. But again, these are things that the FBI has come up with that help us and can help all investigators. You don't have to be a criminal profiler. Anyone that's going into any type of investigative work can use these techniques. Now, when it comes to crime scene profiling, some people find flaws with it. A lot of, little published research on the utility, reliability, and validity, of coming up with a profile based on the evidence that this is a white male in his mid to late 20s who has bad relationships with his mom. If you rely solely on that and you don't pay attention to the actual evidence that you have, it can get you in a lot of trouble. Two basic flaws in modern day profiling: the assumption that human behavior is consistent across a variety of time and situations, that you can rely on MO or signature or any of those things, organized, disorganized, to allow you to link cases, because that's not always the case. And that offense style or evidence gathered at the crime scene is directly related to specific personality characteristics. Again, looking at the characteristics of the crime scene or the victimology, or how the victim is posed or staged or anything like that, and making assumptions about somebody's personality based on that evidence can get you into trouble. But most experienced investigators know this. They can use this information to kind of point them in the right direction, but they're not going to ignore the evidence at the actual crime scene. All right, equivocal death analysis. This is also called a reconstructive psychological evaluation, and it's really this is done after somebody has already passed away. It's reconstructing the emotional life, behavioral patterns, cognitive features of the deceased. So that's why it's called a psychological autopsy. It's usually done to determine the cause of death when the cause of death is ambiguous. In other words, was it a homicide or was it a suicide? This is really when it is done for insurance purposes or for criminal investigations. So again, and usually reserved for homicide versus suicide, when you can't tell right away which one is which. All right, that brings us to multiple murders. There's a difference between the types of multiple murders. Serial killers is one person kills two or more people in separate events with, and this is key, a cooling off period in between. The cooling off period can be days, weeks, maybe even years, but usually months between offenses. So when you look at serial killers, for example, like Ted Bundy, Ted Bundy had some days where he killed, a couple of people in one day, and then there would be weeks and even months between his killings. So that's what really makes serial killing different from other types of killing, is having that cooling off period. Serial killers are typically, and we've already talked about antisocial personality disorder and that psychopathic behavioral pattern. Most serial killers do have that psychopathic behavioral pattern. Most of their killings are premeditated and planned, like Ted Bundy. Sometimes they go out and happen upon their victims, but they set out looking for victims. Sometimes offenders do have a preference for their victims. For example, Ted Bundy is a great example of this. If you look at pictures of all of his victims, they were all, young female victims. Most of them had kind of dark, long, straight hair parted in the middle. So some of them do have a preference for certain types of victims. A spree murder is the killing of 2 or more victims at multiple locations with no cooling off period. So the offender starts killing people at one location and then goes to a second location or more. For example, somebody might shoot family members. This is actually pretty common, shoot family members and then goes to school or work and kills people. If you think back a few years to that horrific shooting at the Sandy Hook Elementary School, that would be an example of a spree killer. The offender in that case killed his mom at home and then went to the school and killed people there. Mass murder. Mass murder is the killing of 4 or more people at a single location, and again, no cooling off period between murders. There are several different types of mass murder. So it can be an individual who is responsible, or a group, or a government sponsored. 2 traditional types. Number 1 would be the classic type. The offender enters a location and randomly kills people. A lot of school shootings are like this, like Virginia Tech. It could also be other mass shootings like we had in Vegas a couple years ago, or the shooting that took place in a movie theater in Arizona. And technically, 9/11 would be the example of mass murder as well. Because we had, and that would be an example of a terrorist-sponsored mass murder. We also have a family where one family member kills at least 3 other people and then often kills themselves. All right, with serial killers, the U.S. Department of Justice estimates that there are anywhere between 30 to 40 active serial murderers at any given time in the United States. The number of serial murders has decreased in the United States over the years from we had kind of a peak in the 1970s and 1980s, but it has gone down. No accurate data on the prevalence and number of serial murders active, but it's estimated again that 30 to 40. Research is difficult because we really don't know how many are active and how many victims they have and how many cases are related to each other. Serial killers don't always tell the truth. They can minimize their numbers. They can inflate their numbers. So it's really kind of difficult. With victim selection, I mentioned that often they have a particular type. They often seek victims who won't be noticed or missed right away, which actually makes it a little bit more difficult in many cases. So preying on homeless people, preying on sex workers that might not be reported missing right away. When it comes to the type of victims that they are looking for, it really depends on the serial killer, but availability, the vulnerability of the victims, desirability, single victim offenders, families and acquaintances. Serial murders are with strangers typically. With MO and serial offenders tend to be hands-on killing, planning in disposal of the body. The serial killers typically don't just leave the victims out in the open. They usually try to dispose of the body, try to hide the body. Think of the Atlanta child murders, for example. Most of the bodies were dumped in the river. Some were, left out in wooded areas. Ted Bundy often took his victims to wooded areas. When it comes to geographical locations, most serial killers do have kind of a comfort zone, which can help you if you're using that geographical profiling that I told you about earlier. Remember, I already mentioned Rossimo's 4 hunting patterns that he developed. That's not always going to help you, though. But when you look at something like the Boston Strangler, if you're looking at Jack the Ripper, if you're looking at somebody that's staying in a pretty consistent geographical location, that can be helpful. But if you're looking at somebody like Ted Bundy, who went from state to state, geographical profiling is not going to be helpful because he was, offending in Washington State, in Colorado, in Florida. So it's not always going to be helpful, but a lot of them do stay in one geographical area. Ethnic and racial characteristics of serial killers. Approximately 21.8% of the serial killers in the United States have been black. That means 80% of serial killers are actually white males. We don't really have a lot of research um, on on ethnic minorities and serial killers because the vast majority of serial killers are white males. When it comes to risk factors and psychological motives of serial killers, there's no one factor that we have learned, but we do know from looking at the backgrounds of serial killers or interviewing serial killers that they do tend to have a history of abuse and neglect. Most have a desire for some type of media attention. Not all, but a lot of them do. If you look historically at things like offenders like the Zodiac killer, the BTK killer, they would send letters to newspapers and sometimes to the police as well. In addition to abuse, they often have deprivation, family violence. Most do not have mental health issues that would involve things like being psychotic or hearing voices or delusions or anything like that. I mean, definitely antisocial personality disorder, but they're not having any problems with reality. Most are not impulsive. Most are pretty deliberate and premeditated and careful. Most get some type of sexual gratification from the victimization, and some of them begin killing at a late age. But most serial killers, and by the way, there's also a very high number of serial killers had some type of head trauma in childhood. I already kind of talked about that when we were talking about James Fallon's research on the brains of people with that psychopathic behavioral pattern, and how he talked about that's probably a genetic thing. You're born with this, and then something flips it on, and it could be. And he was talking about how having that history of child abuse is probably flipping that on, but add a head injury to that, and you're probably flipping that on as well. Now, female serial killers are technically very rare. Women just don't really get involved in violent crime that often. There was one study that was done in 1999 who identified only 34 documented cases of female serial killers after 1900, and 82% of those were actually after 1900. There are probably more than that. There are female serial killers who are healthcare workers who say they are putting people out of their misery or helping people end their lives, but if you're doing that to several victims, that would technically be a serial killer. When you look at female serial killers, a third of them kill strangers. 2/3 their victims are husbands or former husbands or suitors, children, elderly, something like that. They tend to last longer with their behaviors. So with female serial killers, there's an average of 8 to 11 years before they get caught, with an average of 9 murders. Eileen Wuornos is probably the most contemporary example of a female serial killer. She killed 7 men in Florida. There's a movie based on her life called Monster. You may have heard about that. And she's also a great example of having a childhood that was horrific, and also being victimized even well into her early adulthood. Sometimes the motive is material gain, like money. They tend to use less lethal means, although because women tend to not kill with firearms. Women tend to kill with less horrific means, like with poisons or pill overdoses. But Eileen Wuornos, there's always exception. Eileen Wuornos used a gun, and she was very close up and personal with her gun, with her victims. She also did rob her victims, by the way. It's a great movie if you want to watch that, and it gives you kind of some insight into the background of female serial killers. I already mentioned that there are kind of two types of mass murders: the classic mass murder, public mass murders, and then family as well. Um, Public mass shootings, we have seen an increase in the number of mass shootings here in the United States involving terrorist acts, obviously. But between 1983 and 2012, there have been approximately 78 public mass shootings in the United States. That includes business locations, schools as well. Perpetrators are typically white males who act alone. They tend to have mental health issues, and there tends to be something that triggered them. So maybe a breakup, a loss of a job, something that kind of triggers the behavior. Most do not have a criminal history. Most do carefully plan out their crimes, and most do plan to die in the shooting, and most do actually either die by their own hand or by suicide by cop. Um, there was a typology created by Fox and Levin in 2003, proposed that mass murder typology, and this one was based on the motivation for the killing. Number one, revenge against an individual or a group. Number two, power. They seek power and domination over their victims. Number three, loyalty, a warped sense of love or loyalty. Most family mass murders fall under this category, by the way. Profit, the intention is to eliminate victims or witnesses. And terror, send a message through horrific crimes like 9/11, for example. All right, that brings us to school violence. School violence, by the way, we're familiar with school shootings. We've seen a lot of those in the past years. But when we're talking about school violence, it's any type of violence that takes place on school property. So that includes things like robbery, sexual assault, aggravated assault, all those kinds of things that can take place fighting on school violence. So we have had a rash of school violence since the 1990s. Statistically, students are more likely to become victims away from school, but we are seeing an increase. Here's just a couple of, I mentioned Sandy Hook a few minutes ago, but Columbine High School, the Virginia Tech shooting. I mean, there are just a number of school shootings that we could talk about that have taken place at every level of school. So that's elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, and even colleges. Now, with school shooters, again, statistically, it's very rare. But what we have found by looking at the background of school shooters or interviewing those who have survived is most had that peer rejection that we talked about. So they've had peer rejection, social rejection. They're kind of outcast in their schools. Most have been the victims of some type of bullying. Most have shown some type of cruelty to animals. There is a fascination with weapons. Most have access to weapons in the home. So maybe the parents have weapons, but there tends to be something that that we see as a correlation: access to weapons in the home. Most actually somehow made their intentions known ahead of time, usually through social media. So there's usually a lot of red flags with school shooters that nobody pay attention to. Most have a history of psychological problems. So there's mental health issues. There's mental health red flags that went on, again, that people didn't see. They tend to have no friends or very few friends. Again, no social support. They feel isolated and alone. Peer rejection and social rejection seem to be the two characteristics that are pretty consistent when we look at all school shooters. That lack of social support and having pro-social friends is equal to a lack of protective factors, since friends and social support protect young people from violence. So they don't have that attachment to friends, to schools, to teachers, to their parents, to peers that kind of act as protective factors. I already talked about that interest in guns and also just having access to guns. Half of the school shooters that were studied had a history of violence with animals. And again, the attacks were planned. But if you look at any school shooting, I promise you that you can find red flags that somebody didn't pay attention to. And by the way, in school bullying, I mentioned being the victims of bullying is also predominant with a lot of these cases. Many of the school shooters and school shootings reported being victims of bullying, including Columbine and Virginia Tech. Bullying can have negative effects on, obviously, victims, but people that bully are often victimized themselves. All right, workplace violence. Workplace aggression or violence are incidents of aggression that take place either on, within work grounds or targeted against people through their work. So, workplace aggression is a term used to describe forms of behavior by which an individual attempts to harm others at work. It can range from subtle behaviors to active confrontation to destruction of property. Workplace violence refers to incidents where the goal or intent is to physically harm individuals or organizations, or it can just be the work that you do itself. So law enforcement officers, security guards, are more likely to be injured in the line of work. Oops, sorry. Again, but workplace violence is when somebody intends to cause physical or bodily harm to an individual at a workplace or an organization itself. There was a typology that was created by Gregory. And this typology, remember, typology is a category, a way to identify categories. So this particular typology for workplace violence has 4 types of offenders who engage in workplace violence. So type 1, there's no relationship. The motive is often robbery or criminal intent. So there's no legitimate relationship to the workplace. The terrorist actions like robbery or theft. The mass majority of violence and homicides are type 1. So somebody's killed at their workplace while a crime is going on. So you work in a liquor store and you are hurt, shot, or somehow injured or even murdered while that liquor store is being robbed. Type 2, you are the offender is the recipient of some type of service or a former client. So the offender received some type of service or had that type of relationship. You were a customer, you were a client, they were a former patient, something like that. Type 3, coworkers. Current or former employee includes authority. Homicide, where the target includes people in higher positions than the offender. But it is somebody that goes into a workplace and shows violence towards people that they work with or did work with. And then type 4 is personal. So this is where there's an indirect relationship through an employee. So like a current or former spouse goes into a workplace to target that person, and other people are also hurt in that violence. Perpetrators of workplace violence are often disgruntled employees, the type 3. They tend to lack social support. There's usually some type of mental health history, and there's usually something that triggers workplace violence. So again, maybe being fired with the type 4 where it's personal, a breakup of some type, that type of thing. Now with type 1, it just involves somebody's work. So it's a crime that's committed at somebody's work, a robbery, a theft of a gas station, of a convenience store, of a restaurant, something like that, or working in a job that tends to have violence. But with type 2, 3, and 4, there's usually some type of either previous or current relationship with the workplace or a personal relationship, and something generally triggers the person, just like with mass shootings. All right, there are some interesting resources in D2L. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great rest.